So this is a project that we had funded through SPRITE, which is called Smooth, and that looked at digital onboarding and digital onboarding with a particular focus on marginalized communities. And this particular presentation is really to look at the Horizon Scan component of that project. So the purpose of the Horizon Scan was to look at two sets of trends, as it turns out. The actual Horizon Scan was to look at the trend lines in technologies, the challenges, where the drive, so basically the drivers, the challenges across political, economic, social, legal, technical, technological kind of aspects, and to then basically to pitch forward to see where essentially public policy and technologists and researchers could usefully interface in the development of that. And we looked at it from the purposes of marginalized communities on the very simple premise, actually, which is that if you can essentially make right or to reduce the friction in onboarding for these communities, essentially the premise is that you'll have it right for all types of community, so those that aren't as marginalized. That is heavily premised, I think, on a Eurocentric approach to understanding what communities might be marginalized. I hasten to add as my caveat. We also had a focus on public sector onboarding processes, and we stuck within Horizon Scanning best practice to not look further than 5 years, because beyond 5 years, you sort of find it very difficult to follow the thread through, and essentially it's a sort of branch of kind of futurology more than assessment. So it's within a 5-year time frame, with the caveat around public sector. So what we want to do is identify the signals rather than the noise. So what are the future developments going to be in these onboarding, in digital onboarding onto public service platforms, with a view, actually. So part of this kind of presentation is in 2 parts. One is around, and it's slightly back to front, but actually I hope the logic thread will persist, and you're a sophisticated audience, so I have high confidence in this. The first is around observations on the state of the field, and then the second part is on the substance, i.e. on where that Horizon Scan of the technologies takes us. And the reason for doing so will become clear in a moment, but it's around, so we have privacy by design, we have security by design, and what I want to sort of gently float is that maybe we have inclusivity by design as well, because actually what we see through this is that the friction points for marginalized communities are so severe that actually you either need a plan B for that digital onboarding to accommodate those marginalized communities, or you have to design inclusivity in from the start. So in terms of the structured assessment, and this is all due credit to my colleague Tassos, this was a structured literature review that ran from 1998 to 2024, premised on Web of Science and Scopus on the search term digital ident, obviously allowing then for permutations at the end of identities. So what it drives is this, which you can see, 514 conference papers from the total pool of 1,547. 800, so just over half were articles, a very small number of books in context of the entire pool, a larger number of book chapters. Now, the things I found interesting out of this structured review, which I think should be of interest to all of us researching in this area, is actually I was surprised by the lower number of conference papers as opposed to articles. So that suggests that people are essentially, in essence, bypassing the conferences and going straight to articles. And in another piece of work that Tassos and I did, which he'll be presenting on much later on this afternoon, actually we question the quality of quite a large corpus of these articles. So there's something that's like echoes with the later presentation in that regard as well. The small number of books I think is entirely consistent. I wouldn't expect to have seen a large number of books. The international collaborations I do think are low, and I think is of interest, and should be of interest to all of us, actually, because what that implies to me is that are we actually seeing a literature generated on exceptional cases, i.e. on case by case, country by country, rather than on international, or not sharing best practice across. And the average site per document, I think, is also relatively low, given the kind of permissiveness or pervasiveness, rather, not permissiveness, pervasiveness of the subject. I think this demonstrates, and we have all sorts of graphs that have been generated around the work that Tassos has done, but I think this one is quite nice to see the evolution and development of the disciplinary field. So we start from the wrong end, which is obviously the most current. It's at this end we start to see research being conducted around e-government, blockchain, facial recognition, biometrics. These things aren't really pulled through from prior years or prior exposures, but electronic document identification systems is a continuous. But actually there is, and you can see the sort of the uneven topography of the field as it pulls through these various eras, and that does lend me so one of my sub conclusions is really around what is driving the curiosity-led research that we're doing. So one might also ask whether it is curiosity-led research or whether it's being driven by something else. So is it being driven by a reading of the discipline of what will essentially be able to be placed in the literature? Is it being led by other factors around funding? Is it being led by access to platforms or to research materials? But it strikes me that this uneven topography that we can see in the evolution of the field is telling us something about the way that researchers are essentially accessing and attacking these questions. Again, a kind of very sort of similar picture, I think, in terms of that topography, as I need to find a new word for it, but essentially that actually distributed ledger forms its own little cluster and is focused around several issues. There's a much bigger sway, and actually this is what we saw in the structured literature review. We see an absolute diffusion of research effort, and that's incorporated by the red block. And then the blue block is again is sort of slightly more tightly confined, but it seems to be actually quite instrumentally based around identity systems. Again, this is essentially an extrapolation of the point made 2 slides ago around the interdisciplinary nature of the work. What's interesting to me here, and I think there are plausible reasons for it, you don't see a lot from what might loosely have been described as Eastern Europe or Eastern Europe, and that may well be something around almost like export control issues, put politely, but it also might be around linguistics. Similarly, Southern America or Latin America and the continent of Africa, but in particular sub-Saharan Africa, is poorly represented, as is quite a large amount of the Middle East. And we know that there's a lot of research that has been conducted into digital identity and digital platforms in the Middle East. But again, I wonder whether actually some of that is incorporated into what might loosely be described as export controls, i.e. this sort of research is kept for national security reasons in-house rather than being published. It may also be something to do with linguistics as well, of course. So again, presented in a slightly different way, the US is the dominant international player. The UK then comes out next. China, as one might expect. India has a considerable amount of computer and technological joy in this space, and actually a really good case study in terms of digital identity onboarding in one of their regions. And again, as kind of explained, there are gaps, with Iran really being the only country in the Middle East that obviously comes in this top sort of 15, 20 countries, which I think is surprising. So just as a summary on that first section, really, I think surprisingly low incidence of international collaboration. Again, as described, that geographical spread. I wonder whether, so in other graphs that we could present and probably happily to share either in a sort of paper form or whatever, there is strong concentrations by particular countries, actually at particular university level as well, and even as individual scholars who appear quite a lot. So there's a query for me in terms of this data and where research groups in tech companies, so either in the large multinational tech companies or in SMEs, but those with quite strong research functions, where those papers are ending up and whether they are ending up basically being capable of being structure sifted in an exercise like this or not. And then we definitely know that this doesn't apply to this last community, which is high-end government assessment. So in the UK, for example, somewhere like DSTL will not publish their papers unless it's for a very particular purpose. and therefore we're missing out on that in terms of looking at our structured review. So there's quite an interesting interplay between sort of three sets of communities, which might be academics, government analysts, and high-end tech concern researchers, but 2 out of the 3 are actually quite closed and obscured to us. And that's quite interesting in terms of the development of the field as well. And again, then my point around whether it's actually the private sector or government-led kind of impetuses about what we're researching and why, and what drivers are there to enable us to do that. So in terms of the substantive horizon scan that was taking place, the technological focus, so there's an awful lot of material really around this sort of rapid advancement. So what we found in the structured literature review was an awful lot of papers that basically were, to use the business speak, sort of flying a kite for their particular chosen application, but without actually demonstrating it or having an empirical basis that actually described what happened when that was used. The legal and regulatory signals, that's a piecemeal kind of global approach. So there's a lot of work on actually almost like, again, sort of preemptive understandings of where the legal side and the regulatory side will appear with this work, but without actually having anything to actually look at. So again, it's all just preemptive. It's beyond speculation in that case, but it is preemptive. And then societal considerations around access, privacy, security, that really are, I think, again, almost have the exceptionism of case by case or country by country, because they're all very nested in norms and understandings and histories within those individual countries. But the trend lines, because I'm conscious that I was very conscious of time, and I still am looking at my watch. So I've got a slide deck that essentially looks at each of the main technologies, but I won't have time to present that. But you can have the slide deck and you can see what I did. So I did trend lines and I did a summary, and then I've got the individuals. So in terms of trend lines, the development in this space around digital identity and onboarding around digital identity, even in the public sector space, has been dominated by commercial developers, and therefore has been dominated by venture capital or angel, depending on the size of the business, capital as well, rather than necessarily government initiatives. That feeds into a changed model in government of partnering, of extensive partnership, of almost an elision between the public and the private in terms of procurement and in terms of developing high-end technological spaces. So I think there's something interesting within that space. I think the fact that the commercial side are in one sense leading the norms and standards, and indeed risk perception, like, should be of interest to us as researchers in this space. It's also the case, and as you know, was famously kind of said at the time of Edward Snowden and his either whistleblow or leak, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, that the understanding, and therefore the understanding in the public sector and certainly within political spheres, and then the regulation that comes forward has been quite slow. In his case, in secrecy and mass surveillance, very slow. And therefore, there's this gap where essentially the standards, in inverted commas, are being essentially set by players that would be unusual in our common understanding of how technology and regulation works. The second trend line, and when I saw your message, Mark, about whether you could record it, I regretted this Babel fish. So you might allow me the courtesy of being able to change it before you put it up online. The second one is around the adoption. So obviously, as I say, we were looking at marginalized communities, but it's the education and the adoption. So the adoption was partly financial and economic. The adoption was also partly normative, i.e. the sentiment, the confidence of particular communities in essentially offshoring identity, as they would see it, to an outside provider. And also in terms of education, of literally the ability to use that technology because of physical or other hindrances. And so actually that part of this is really important in terms of capturing the widest sort of spread of community. This notion amongst some of the technologies, i.e. biometrics, but also blockchain as well, around immutability and whether actually there's a plan B if my iris somehow gets compromised, i.e. the sort of map that comes off it for signing gets compromised, what's my plan B? Because changing eyes is not high on my list of considerations, but actually where is the fallback for this? But ultimately this basically breaks down into bifurcated questions of trust, so technical security, and I think those questions are very, very apt for international collaboration, i.e. going back to one of my earlier points about the discipline or sets of disciplines. And then the second one, which is around sentiment, so questions of trust. So at moments when governments are basically under-trusted or untrusted, actually those sentiment questions for adoption are large. So someone might actually have more confidence in basically offshoring or onboarding via Apple's various biometric platforms because they have greater confidence in Apple than they might do in the British government, for example. And then this latter point, which is because we're dealing with platforms where the underpinning technologies are essentially or most likely not going to be British in this instance, we have issues of extraterritoriality, i.e. where does the law stand? Where do I gain legal recourse in the UK if, for example, something has gone awry with a piece of Apple platforms technology that enabled me to onboard to my local GP? As an extreme example, and those questions are really very germane. So there's the summary slide that comes before the wider slides, but I don't have time for those. So there is, I think we have to be I do think looking at this area, and for marginalized communities in particular, there is the potential to basically reduce the friction and to improve access to the widest array of public services, because that was our frame. But actually, so whilst that is the theory and we should retain techno joy as a shorthand for that, actually it does depend on essentially sentiment and technology. So does it require a piece of technology that costs hundreds of pounds for that person to be able to access it? If yes, that's a big hindrance. Does it rely on any specialist understanding or enough understanding to enable trust to occur? I don't need to understand, for example, how the blockchain works, but I need to understand that it's going to be okay. And those questions are, I think, particularly relevant in the case of marginalized community and public services, because we can see, and the reason why Blair and Haig are on the screen is because their jointly written or jointly kind of sponsored piece from the Blair Institute talks about the real public service gains and benefit to the Treasury for being able to do this. So actually the really big hindrances in that are essentially the accessibility and the trust. And so I would obviously say, because it's not turkeys voting for Christmas, that continuous horizon scanning is necessary in order to have a closer sense of that.